right? It says that we would find the domain, the asymptotes, x-intercepts, y-intercepts, and then we can graph. But remember, yesterday, that first bullet point said we should go ahead and factor, right? So let's go ahead and do that. On number 1, that's a difference of squares there on top, right? So that should factor. So I'm going to make my 2 factors. Remember, whatever I put here and here comes from the first term. What multiplies to give us 4? 2 and 2. And then whatever I put here and here comes from this term. What multiplies to give me x squared? Right. And like we said, it's a difference of squares, so what should my signs be? Yeah, plus minus. All right. Doesn't look like there's anything we can factor in the bottom, so we're going to leave it as 2 plus x. But what do you notice now? Right, we got something that they have in common, which means, right, they divide out. Okay? When you have something that divides out, that's where you have a whole. Okay, so we didn't have to do anything else. We just had to factor it like normal, right? So we are going to have a whole. All right, let's go about finding everything else like we did yesterday. So remember, domain, we said, comes from the denominator, right? What would I not want to plug in for x because it's going to give me 0 in the bottom? Negative 2. So I would say that my domain is that x cannot equal negative 2, same as yesterday. All right, now horizontal asymptote. Remember, that's our 3 acronyms, right? BOBO, BOTN, and EATS DC. Which one do we have here? Bigger on top. What does bigger on top mean? None. So we do not have a horizontal asymptote this time. All right? Vertical asymptotes. Remember, that comes from our function once we have factored it, right? We take the bottom and set it equal to 0. But once we factored, this crossed out, right? So was there anything left in the bottom? No. So there also is no vertical asymptote. Nothing to graph there because there was nothing left in the bottom. All that ended up being left was 2 minus x, right? Okay. Then they ask about the whole. Well, we did say there would be a whole, right, because there was something that crossed out. The whole occurs at this x value. What x value is that? What do I get when I solve those for x? Negative 2. So I'm going to have a whole with an x value of negative 2. To find the y value, all we need to do is go plug in that x into the simplified version. Okay? So if I were to go plug it in, I'd have 2 minus, and then we plug in x, which we now know to be negative 2. All right, well, minus and negative really means we're adding, right? Okay, so when I add 2 plus 2, I'm going to get 4. So my whole is at the point negative 2, 4. All right. Then remember, our x-intercepts, guys, came from the top, right? Well, these divided out, but there was still one thing left in the top, right? This piece right here. So when I solve that for x, 2 minus x equals 0, where do we end up getting an x-intercept? At positive 2. All right. And then the last thing we have to do is find our y-intercept. Okay, well, our y-intercept, remember, is when we go and replace all the x's in the equation with 0, right? Okay, so in this particular case, if we look back at the equation, this is all that was left when it was all said and done, right? So I'm going to have y is equal to 2 minus 0, right? So what's the y value? 2. So I'm going to have a y-intercept at 0, 2. Okay, so let's graph what we found. We didn't have any asymptotes. We have a whole at negative 2. positive 4. So negative 2, positive 4. So up here I've got a hole. We also said we had an x-intercept at 2. And a y-intercept at 2. So if I were to go and connect all of these, looks something like this, right? And there's no asymptote, so we don't have to worry about if there's different sections of our graph. All right, let's do another one. Okay, so example number 2. Looks like they actually already factored this one for us, right? So nothing to factor here. Do you guys see anything that will cross out like last time? Right. So because those x plus 3's cancel out, that tells us we will have a hole, right? Okay, and my leftovers are all that I'm going to use. So the x plus 2 times 2x minus 1 in the top over x plus 4 times x minus 1. All right, so for my domain, remember we look at the original. What numbers would I not want to plug in here because it's going to give me zeros? Negative 4, 1, and in the original, what else? Right, we look at the original for our domain. So x cannot equal negative 4, negative 3, or positive 1. All right, horizontal asymptotes. Remember, those come from our acronyms. BOBO, BOTN, EATS, DC. Now, these are not multiplied together, so I might be confused on what the biggest exponents are. Well, if I multiply the x's, that's going to give me the exponent, right? X times 2x is going to give me 2x squared. Okay, so in the top, we're going to have a 2x squared. In the bottom, if I multiply the x's, x times x is going to give me x squared. So are we bigger on top, bigger on bottom, or the same? Same, So EATS DC, what do I do? 2 divided by 1. So we have a horizontal asymptote at 2. All right. Vertical asymptote. Remember, that comes from the bottom of the simplified form, right? After we've crossed out. So I'm looking at this part. So where does that part tell me we're going to have vertical asymptotes? So we'll have one at negative 4 and one at positive 1. Okay. The holes. Remember, the holes, guys, came from the part we crossed out. So what x value did we cross out? Negative 3. Remember, when it's in the parentheses, it's opposite of what it actually is. Okay? And if I want to know what the y value is, remember, I go plug the x into this simplified form over here. So I would have negative 3 plus 2 times 2 times negative 3 minus 1 over negative 3 plus 4 times negative 3 minus 1. All right, so negative 3 plus 2 would be, right? And 2 times negative 3 would be negative 6, and then we also have a minus 1. So negative 6 minus 1 would be, right? And then in the denominator, negative 3 plus 4 is 1. Negative 3 minus 1 is negative 4, right? So in the top, negative 1 times negative 7 is going to give me a positive 7 over negative 4. Good. So we are going to have a hole at negative 7 over 4. All right. Okay, and then for my x-intercepts, remember that comes from the top of the simplified form. So my two top pieces, the first one tells me we'll have an x-intercept at -2, right? And when I solve that other one, it tells us we'll have 1 at 1/2. All right? Okay, and then y-intercept, remember that means replace all the x's with zeros. So I'm going to have 0 plus 2 times 2 times 0 minus 1 over 0 plus 4 times 0 minus 1. So here, 0 plus 2 is 2. 2 times 0 is 0. So I'm going to have 2 times -1 in the top. Then in the bottom, 0 plus 4 is 4. 0 minus 1 is -1, right? So I'd have -2 over -4, which simplifies to 1/2. So we have a y-intercept at 0, 1/2. All right, so now we are going to graph everything we found. So let's start with graphing our asymptotes. So we said we're going to have a horizontal asymptote at +2. So up here I've got a horizontal asymptote. We said we were going to have vertical asymptotes at -4 and +1. Okay. We also said we had a hole at -3, -7/4. So somewhere down here that's -1 3/4. So somewhere in here we've got a hole. We also said we had x-intercepts at -2, 0 and +1/2. And a y-intercept at +1/2. All right, so I'm going to connect the points that we do have. So if I were to do that, it's going to look something like this, right? Because I can't go up. There's a horizontal asymptote. Okay, and then remember the trick I showed you guys yesterday was you can make a number line and just put the important x values on it. So our important x values would be our asymptotes, which were at -4 and +1. And then our x-intercepts, which were at -2 and +1/2. All right. So if we look at our picture, between -2 and 1/2, we're positive, right? We're above the x-axis. Okay, so in that section, we know we're positive. But in this section, we can see that we're below the line, so negative, right? So this section is negative, and so is this section right here. So this section right here is negative. So without even plugging in numbers, what should I know the two on the end are going to be? Positives, because it's going to follow that pattern. Okay, so I'm going to have a curve here and a curve here. That way you don't have to plug in so many points, okay? All right, we've got just a few minutes.